hawk in the dark. The walker said in a whisper, "No." "Hawken," Merriman said again gently, "every man has a last chance after the first. A chance of forgiveness. It is not too late. Turn, come to the light." The voice was scarcely audible, a mere husking breath. "No." The flames hung still and stately round the great hall. No one moved. "Hawken," Merriman said, and there was no command in the tone, but only warmth and entreaty. "Hawken, liege man, turn away from the dark. Try to remember. There was love and trust between us once." The walker stared at him like a doomed man, and now in the pointed, lined face Will could see clearly the traces of the small, bright man Hawken, who had been brought forward out of his time for the retrieving of the Book of Grammari, and had, through the shock of facing death, betrayed the old ones to the dark. He remembered the pain that had been in Merriman's eyes as they watched that betrayal begin, and the terrible certainty with which he had contemplated Hawken's doom. The walker still stared at Merriman, but his eyes did not see. They looked back through time as the old man rediscovered all that he had forgotten or pushed out of his mind. He said slowly, with mounting reproach, "You made me risk my life for a book. For a book? Then because I looked at kind masters, you sent me back to my own time, and not as I had been before. You gave me then the doom of bearing the sign." His voice grew stronger with pain and resentment as he remembered. "The sign of bronze. Through the centuries, you changed me from a man into a creature, always running, searching, always hunted. You stopped me from growing decently old in my own time, as all men after their lives grow old and tired and sink to sleep in death. You took away my right to death. You set me in my own century with the sign long, long ago, and you made me carry it through 600 years until this age." His eyes flickered toward Will and flashed with hatred. "Until the last of the old ones should be born and take the sign from me, you boy. It is all through you. This turning in time that took away my good life as a man. It was all on your account, before you were born and after. For your damn gift of Grammari, I have lost everything I had ever loved." I tell you, Merriman cried out. "You may come home, Hawken, now. It is the last chance, and you may turn to the light and be as you were." His proud, towering figure leaned forward, beseeching, and Will felt pain for him, knowing that he felt it was his own misjudgment that had brought his servant Hawken into betrayal, and the life of the wretched walker, a whining shell committed to the dark. Merriman said huskily, "I pray you, my son." "No," the walker said. "I found better masters than you." And the 9 flames of the dark round the walls sprang cold and high and burned with the blue light quivering. He clutched closer at the dark blanket wrapped round him and stared wildly about the hall. Shrilly defiant, he shouted, "Masters of the dark, I bring you in!" And the 9 flames moved in closer, moved in closer from the walls to the center of the room, approaching Will and the 4 outward-facing old ones. Will was blinded by their blue-white brilliance. He could no longer see the walker. Somewhere beyond the great lights, the shrill voice shrieked on, high and mad with bitterness. "You risked my life for the book. You made me carry the sign. You let the dark hound me through the centuries, but never let me die. Now it is your turn." "Your turn! Your turn!" echoed the scream round the walls. The 9 tall flames moved slowly closer, and the old one stood in the center of the floor and watched them approach. Beside the hearth, Merriman turned slowly toward the center of the room. Will saw that his face was impassive again, the deep eyes dark and empty and the lines drawn firm, and he knew that no one would see any strong, self-revealing emotion on that face for a very long time. The walker's chance to turn back to the mind and heart of Hawken had come and been rejected, and now it was gone forever. Merriman raised both his arms, and the cloak fell from them like wings. His deep voice whispered in the crackling silence, "Stop." The 9 flames paused and hung. "In the name of the Circle of Science," Merriman said, clear and firm, "I command you to leave this house." The cold light of the dark that was all around the hall behind the great standing flames flickered and crackled like laughter, and out of the blackness beyond came the Black Rider's voice. "Your circle is not complete, and has not the force," he called mockingly. "And your liege man has called us into this house as he did before, and can again. Ah, liege man, my lord, the hawk is in the dark. You can drive us from here no longer with the flame, nor force, nor conjured power. We shall break your sign of fire before it can be released, and your circle will never be joined. It will break in the cold, my lord, in the dark and the cold." Will shivered. It was growing cold indeed in the hall, very cold. The air was like a current of chill water coming at them from all sides. The fire in the great hearth gave out no warmth now, no warmth that was not sucked in by the cold blue flames of the dark all around. The 9 flames quivered again, and he looked at them. He could have sworn they were not flames, but gigantic icicles, blue-white, as before, but solid, menacing great pillars ready to topple inward and crush them with the weight of cold. "Cold!" said the Black Rider softly from the shadows. "Cold!" Will looked at Merriman in alarm. He knew that each of them, every old one in the room, had been thrusting against the dark with every power he possessed since the rider's voice began, and he knew that none of it had had any effect. Merriman said softly, "Hawken lets them in, as he did in his first betrayal, and we cannot prevent that. He had my trust once, and it gives him still that power even though the trust is gone. Our only hope is what was in the beginning, that Hawken is no more than a man. When the spells of the deep cold are made, there is little that can be done against them." He stood, frowning at the ring of blue-white fire, as the ring of blue-white fire flickered and danced. Even he looked cold, with a dark, pinched look round the bones of his face. They bring in the deep cold," he said half to himself, "the cold of the void, of black space." And the cold grew more and more intense, cutting through the body to the mind. Yet the flames of the dark seemed at the same time to grow dim, and Will realized that his own century was again fading in around them, and they were back in Miss Graythorne's manor. And it was cold there, too. Everything was changing now. The murmur of voices had dropped from a cheerful buzz to an anxious murmur, and the tall room was only dimly lit by candles set in candlesticks and cups and plates. Wherever there was space, all the bright electric lamps were dark, and the long metal radiators that warmed most of the room gave off no heat. Merriman swooped bafflingly up near him with the speed of one returned from a brisk errand. His cloak was different, changed to the sweeping overcoat he had worn earlier that day. He said to Miss Graythorne, "There is not much we can do down there, ma'am. The furnace is out, of course. All the electric power lines are quite dead. So is the telephone. I have had all the house blankets and quilts brought out, and Miss Hampton is making quantities of soup and hot drinks." Miss Graythorne nodded in brisk approval. "Good thing we kept the old gas stoves. They wanted to change, you know, Lion, when we had the central heating done. I wouldn't, though. Electricity, bah! Always knew the old house didn't approve." "I am having as much wood as possible brought in to keep the fire up," Merriman said. But in the same instant, as if in mockery, a great hissing and steaming came from the broad fireplace, and those nearest jerked away, choking and sputtering. Through the sudden inblown cloud of smoke, Will could see Frank Dawson and old George working to clear something out of the fire, but the fire had gone out. "Snow down the chimney!" Fire Dawson called out, coughing. "We'll need buckets, Mary! Quickly! There's a right mess here!" "I'll go," Will shouted and bolted for the kitchen, glad of the chance to move. But before he could get to the door through the huddled groups of chilled, frightened people, a figure rose up before him to block his way, and 2 hands caught his arms in a grip so tight that he gasped in sudden pain. Bright eyes bored into his, glittering with wild triumph, and the walker's high, thin voice was screeching in his ear. Old one, master for the old ones, you know what's going to happen to you. The cold is coming in, and the dark will freeze you, cold and stiff, and all of you helpless. No one to protect the little signs on your belt. Let go! Will twisted angrily, but the old man's hold on his wrist was the clasp of madness. And you know who will take the little signs, old one? I shall, the poor walker. I shall wear them. They are promised to me in reward for my services. No lords of light ever offered me such a reward, or any other. I shall be the sign seeker. I shall, and all that would have been yours at last shall come to me. He grabbed for Will's belt, his face twisted with triumph, spill ringing in his mouth like foam, and Will yelled for help. In an instant, John Smith was at his side, with Dr. Armstrong close behind, and the big Smith had pinned the walker's clutching hands behind his back. The old man cursed and shrieked, his eyes burning with hatred at Will, and both men had to struggle to hold him back. At length, they had him trapped and harmless, and Dr. Armstrong drew back with an exasperated sigh. This clasp must be the only warm object in the country, he said. Of all times to run berserk. This chap must be the only warm object in the country, he said. Of all the times to run berserk. Pulse or no pulse, I'm going to put him to sleep for a while. He's a danger to the community and to himself, Will thought, rubbing his sore wrist. If you only knew quite what sort of danger he is. Then suddenly he began to see what Merriman had meant. Our only hope is what it was in the beginning. That Hawken is no more than a man. Keep him there, John, while I get my bag. The doctor disappeared. John Smith, one big fist, grasping the walker's shoulder and the other both his wrists, winked encouragingly at Will and jerked his head to the kitchen. Will suddenly remembered his original errand and ran. When he came tearing back with 2 empty buckets swinging from each hand, there was a fresh commotion at the fireplace. A new hissing had begun. Smoke spewed out, and Frank Dawson came staggering backwards. Hopeless, he said furiously, hopeless. You get the hearth clear for a moment and more snow comes pouring down in the cold. He looked despairingly about him. Look at them, Will. The room was misery and chaos, small babies wailing, parents huddling their bodies round their children to keep them warm enough to breathe. Will rubbed his chill hands together and tried to feel his feet and his face through the numbness and cold. The room was becoming colder and colder, and from the freezing world outside was no sound even of the wind. The sense of being within 2 levels of time at once still hovered in his mind. Though all he could feel now of the ancient manor was the awareness, ominous and persistent, of the 9 great ice candles glimmering round 3 sides of the room. They had been ghost-like, scarcely visible when he had first found himself brought back by the new cold of his own time. But as the cold grew more intense, so they were growing clearer. Will stared at them. He knew that somehow they embodied the power of the dark at its midwinter peak, yet he knew, too, that they were part of an independent magic harnessed by the dark, which, like so much else in their long battle, could be taken away by the light, if only the right thing were done at the right time. How?